Hello and welcome everyone. Myself Mijanur Rahaman, and today my topic of discussion is regulation of respiration, and it is the third video of this topic. In the previous two videos we have already discussed about the introduction and we have started the nervous mechanism, and in case of nervous mechanism we have already completed the respiratory centers, medullary centers, pontine centers, then connection of respiratory centers and integration of respiratory centers. And today our nervous mechanism will be completed by completing the topic factors affecting respiratory centers. So today our topic is factors affecting respiratory centers. So let us start. So this is our topic, that factors affecting the respiratory centers. Now, the respiratory centers regulate the respiratory movements by receiving impulses from various sources of the body. The first source, that is the impulses from the higher centers. Now, higher centers alter the respiration by sending impulses directly to the dorsal group of neurons. So what happens? The higher centers alter the respiration by sending impulses directly to the dorsal group of neurons. And impulses from anterior cingulate gyrus and genu of corpus callosum, olfactory tubercle, and posterior orbital gyrus of cerebral cortex inhibit the respiration. So what happens? Impulses from the anterior cingulate gyrus, then genu of corpus callosum, then the olfactory tubercle, and the posterior orbital gyrus of cerebral cortex. What happens? That inhibits the respiration. And impulses from the motor area and sylvian area of the cerebral cortex cause forced breathing. So what happens? Impulses from the motor area and the sylvian area of cerebral cortex causes forced breathing. So higher centers alter the respiration by sending impulses directly to the dorsal group of neurons, and impulses from the anterior cingulate gyrus, genu of corpus callosum, and olfactory tubercle, and posterior orbital gyrus of cerebral cortex inhibit the respiration, and impulses from the motor area and the sylvian area of cerebral cortex cause the forced breathing. So one inhibit the respiration, one forced breathing occurs. Now the second point, the second factor, that is the impulses from stress receptor of lungs. So what is that point? The impulses from the stress receptors of lung or Hering-Breuer reflex. So Hering-Breuer reflex is a protective reflex. So what it is? It is an protective reflex that restricts the inspiration and prevents the overstretching of lung tissues. So Hering-Breuer reflex is the protective reflex that restricts the inspiration and prevents the overstretching of lung tissues. And it is initiated by the stimulation of stress receptors of the air passage. So it is initiated by the stress receptors of air passage. Now, stress receptors are the receptors that give the response to stretch of the tissues. Now, these receptors are situated on the wall of the bronchi and bronchioles. So, where the stress receptor present? It is present in the wall of the bronchi and bronchioles. Now, expansion of the lung during inspiration stimulates the stress receptor. Now, expansion during the lungs during inspiration stimulates the stress receptors. Okay. And impulses from stress receptor reach the dorsal group of neurons via vagal afferent fibers and inhibit them. So inspiration stops and expiration starts. And thus the overstretching of lung tissue is prevented. So what happens? The Hering-Breuer reflex is a protective reflex that restricts the inspiration and prevents the overstretching of lung tissues. And it is initiated by the stimulation of stress receptor of the air passage. Now, stress receptors are the receptors which present or which give response to the stress of the tissue. Now, these receptors are situated in the wall of the bronchi and bronchioles, and expansion of lungs during inspiration stimulates the stress receptors, and impulses from the stress receptor reach the dorsal group of neurons via the vagal afferent fibers and inhibit them. And whenever the inhibition occurs, the inspiration stops and expiration starts. So what happens? The inspiration stops and expiration starts. You can see in the figure 126.2, that is, first of all, the inspiration is occurring, the inspiration, then the tidal volume more than 1000 ml, then stretching of lung occurs, then the stimulation of the stress receptor in the air passage occurs, then the impulses through vagal afferent which inhibit the dorsal group of neurons and which inhibits the inspiration and expiration starts. So this is the Hering-Breuer inflation reflex. Here this is a short diagram which you can keep in mind. Now, thus the overstretching of the lung is prevented, and however the Hering-Breuer reflex does not operate during quiet breathing, and it operates only when the tidal volume increases beyond 1000 ml. So it is not occurring always. It is all occur only when the tidal volume increases beyond 1000 ml. Now, Hering-Breuer inflation reflex and deflation reflex. The above mentioned reflex is called Hering-Breuer inflation reflex since it restricts the inspiration and limits the overstretching of the tissues. And reverse of this reflex is called Hering-Breuer deflation reflex. And it takes the place during expiration. During expiration, as the stretching of the lungs is absent, the deflation occurs. Okay. Now, impulses from the J receptors of lungs. J receptors are juxtacapillary receptors. So, what is J receptors? J receptors are juxtacapillary receptors which are present on the wall of the alveoli and have close contact with the pulmonary capillaries. Now, A.S. Painter discovered that these receptors are sensory nerve endings of vagals, and nerve fibers from these receptors are non-myelinated and belong to C type, and few receptors are found on the wall of the bronchi. Now, conditions when the J receptors are stimulated. So, what are the conditions? There are 5 to 6 conditions like pulmonary congestion, then pulmonary edema, then pneumonia, then overinflation of lungs, then microembolism in pulmonary capillaries, and stimulation by exogenous and exogenous chemical substances such as histamine, halothine, bradykinin, serotonin, and phenylaldehyde. Stimulation by exogenous and endogenous chemical substances. And the examples are histamine, halothine, bradykinin, serotonin, and phenylaldehyde. So, what are the conditions when the J receptors are stimulated? First condition is pulmonary congestion. Second type of condition is pulmonary edema. Third one, pneumonia. Fourth one, overinflation of lungs. The fifth one, the microembolism in pulmonary capillaries. The sixth one is stimulation by exogenous and endogenous chemical substances such as histamine, halothin, bradykinin, serotonin, and phenyl D-guanide. Now, effects of stimulation of J receptors. Stimulation of J receptors produces a reflex response which is characterized by apnea, and apnea is followed by hyperventilation, bradycardia, hypotension, and weakness of the skeletal muscle. So what happens? The stimulation of the J receptors produces a reflex response which is characterized by apnea, and apnea is followed by hyperventilation, bradycardia, hypotension, and weakness of skeletal muscle. Now, role of J receptors in physiological condition is not clear, but however, these receptors are responsible for the hyperventilation in patients affected by pulmonary congestion and left heart failure. Now, the fourth point, that is impulses from irritant receptors of lung. Besides the stress receptors, there is another type of receptors in the bronchi and bronchioles of the lungs called irritant receptors. And irritant receptors are the stimulated by the irritant chemical agents such as ammonia and sulfur dioxide. And these receptors send afferent impulses to respiratory centers via vagal nerve fibers. And stimulation of irritant receptors produces reflex hyperventilation, and along with bronchospasm, and hyperventilation along with bronchospasm prevents the further entry of harmful agents into the alveoli. So what is the impulses from the irritant receptor of lungs? Beside the stress receptors, there is another type of receptors in the bronchi and bronchioles of the lungs that is present, which is called irritant receptors. And the irritant receptors are stimulated by irritant chemical agents such as ammonia and sulfur dioxide, and these receptors send afferent impulses to the respiratory centers via the vagal nerve fibers, and stimulation of these irritant receptors produces reflex hyperventilation along with bronchospasm, and hyperventilation along with bronchospasm prevents the further entry of harmful agents into the alveoli. Now, impulses from baroreceptors. The fifth point. Baroreceptors or pressuroreceptors are the receptors which give response to change in the blood pressure. So, what is baroreceptor? Baroreceptors or pressuroreceptors are the receptors which give response to change in blood pressure or BP. Now, function. Baroreceptors is in carotid sinus and arch of aorta give response to increase the blood pressure, and whenever the arterial blood pressure increases, the baroreceptors are activated and send inhibitory impulse to the vasomotor center in the medulla oblongata. This causes decrease in the blood pressure and inhibition of respiration. And however, in physiological condition, the role of baroreceptor in regulation of respiration is insignificant. So what happening here? Baroreceptors in carotid sinus and the arch of aorta give response to increase in blood pressure. Okay. And whenever the arterial blood pressure increases, the baroreceptors are activated and send inhibitory impulse to vasomotor center in medulla oblongata. And this causes decrease in blood pressure and inhibition of respiration. So what happens? This causes decrease in blood pressure and inhibition of respiration. However, in physiological condition, the role of baroreceptor is in regulation of respiration is insignificant. So baroreceptor in the carotid sinus and arch of aorta give response to increase in BP, and whenever the arterial blood pressure increase, the baroreceptor are activated and send inhibitory impulse to the vasomotor and center in the medulla oblongata. This causes decrease in blood pressure and the inhibition of respiration. Now, impulses from chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors play an important role in the chemical regulation of the respiration, and details of chemoreceptors and the chemical regulation of respiration are explained in the later part of this chapter in the chemical mechanism part. Now, impulses from proprioceptors. Proprioceptors are the receptors which give response to change in the position of the body. So, what is proprioceptor? Proprioceptors are the receptors which give response to change in position of the body. Now, these receptors are situated in joints, tendons, and muscles, where it is present joint, tendon, and muscle. And proprioceptors are stimulated during muscular exercise and send the impulse to brain, particularly cerebral cortex, through the somatic afferent nerves. And cerebral cortex in turn causes hyperventilation by sending impulse to the medullary respiratory centers. So, what is the impulse from proprioceptor? Proprioceptor are the receptor which give response to change in the position of the body, and these receptors are situated in the joints, tendons, and muscles. And proprioceptors are stimulated during the muscular exercise, and which send to the proprioceptor are stimulated during the muscular exercise and send impulse to brain, particularly in the cerebral cortex, and through the somatic afferent nerve. And cerebral cortex in turn causes the hyperventilation by sending impulse to the medullary respiratory centers. Now, the eighth point, that is impulses from thermoreceptor. The thermoreceptor are cutaneous receptor. Thermoreceptors are what? Cutaneous receptor which give response to change in the environmental temperature. Thermoreceptors are of two types, namely receptors for the cold and receptor for the warm. The number one receptor is receptor for cold and receptor for warmth. When body is exposed to cold or when cold water is applied over the body, the cold receptor is stimulated and send impulses to cerebral cortex via somatic afferent nerve, and cerebral cortex in turn stimulate the respiratory center and causes hyperventilation. So what happens? Thermoreceptors are nothing but a receptor which is cutaneous receptor, and these type of receptor give response to change in the environmental temperature. And thermoreceptors are of two types, namely the receptors for cold and receptor for warmth. And when the body is exposed to cold or when the cold water is applied over the body, the cold receptors are stimulated and send impulses to the cerebral cortex via the somatic afferent nerves, and cerebral cortex in turn stimulates the respiratory centers and causes the hyperventilation. Now, ninth point or last point, that is impulses from the pain receptors. Pain receptors are those which give response to pain stimulus, and whenever pain receptors are stimulated, the impulses from the are sent to the cerebral cortex via somatic afferent nerves, and cerebral cortex in turn stimulate the respiratory centers and causes hyperventilation. That is a diagram. The thermoreceptor which affects the cerebral cortex, proprioceptor affect the cerebral cortex, pain receptor affect the cerebral cortex, which in turn stimulate the respiratory center, and in the periphery part, the baroreceptor, peripheral chemoreceptor, central chemoreceptor, lung receptor, which directly acts upon the respiratory centers. This acts upon the spinal motor neurons. This acts upon the respiratory muscle, and this finally process of respiration. So these are the factors which affect. So first of all, thermoreceptor, proprioceptor, pain receptor acts upon cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex acts upon respiratory center. Now, central chemoreceptor, lung receptor, baroreceptor, peripheral chemoreceptor. These receptors act upon respiratory centers, which will further act upon the spinal motor neuron, which will further act upon the respiratory muscle, and which will further act upon the process of respiration. Now, if we summarize today's topic, then we have discussed about the factors affecting the respiratory centers. The respiratory centers regulate the respiratory movements by receiving impulses from various sources in the body. So there are 9 points. Number one is impulses from higher center. Number two is impulses from stress receptor of lungs or Hering-Breuer reflex. Number three, that is impulses from J receptors of lung. Number four, that is the impulses from irritant receptors of lungs. Number 5, that is impulses from baroreceptor. Number 6, impulses from chemoreceptors. Number 7, that is impulses from proprioceptors. Number 8, that is the impulses from the thermoreceptor. And 9, or last, that is the impulses from pain receptor. If we summarize the points, so what is impulses from higher receptors? The higher centers alter the respiration by sending impulses directly to the dorsal group of neurons, and impulses from the anterior cingulate gyrus, the genu of corpus callosum, the olfactory tubercle, and the posterior orbital gyrus of the cerebral cortex inhibit the respiration. And impulses from the motor area and the sylvian area of the cerebral cortex causes the forced breathing. Now the second point, that is the impulses from stress receptor of lungs or Hering-Breuer reflex. Now, Hering-Breuer reflex is nothing but a protective reflex that restricts the inspiration and prevents the overstretching of the lung tissues, and it is initiated by the stimulation of stress receptor of the air passage. Now, stress receptor are the receptors which give the response to stress the tissue. Now, these receptors are situated on the wall of the bronchi and bronchioles, and expansion of lungs during inspiration stimulates the stress receptors, and impulses from the stress receptor reach the dorsal group of neurons via the vagal afferent fibers and inhibit them. So the inspiration in that process is stopped and the expiration start. So you have described in this diagram very clearly, that is, first of all, a person takes inspiration or taking oxygen or gas, that is inspiration, then tidal volume is increasing, and it is going beyond the 1000 ml or beyond going the level of 1000 ml, then the stretching of the lungs happens. Then when the lung is stretched more than that part, then the stimulation of stress receptor in the air passage is occurred. Then this type of stimulation will further create some impulses which will go through vagal afferent nerves and which will inhibit the dorsal group of neurons, and the dorsal group of neurons will further inhibit the inspiration and start the expiration. Thus the Hering-Breuer reflex does not operate during the quiet breathing, but it operates only when the tidal volume increases beyond 1000 ml. Now, Hering-Breuer inflation and deflation reflex. The above mentioned reflex is Hering-Breuer inflation reflex, and it restricts the inspiration and limits the overstretching of the lung tissues. And reverse of this reflex is called Hering-Breuer deflation reflex, and it takes place during the expiration. And during expiration, as the stretching of the lungs is absent, the deflation occurs. Now, impulses are from the J receptor. J receptor are juxtacapillary receptors which are present on the wall of the alveoli and have close contact with the pulmonary capillaries. Now, A.S. Pentel is a scientist who discovered that these receptors and also said that these are the sensory nerve endings of vagus. And the nerve fibers from these receptors are non-myelinated and belong to C type. And few receptors are found in the wall of the bronchi. Now, condition when J receptor is stimulated. First is pulmonary congestion, then pulmonary edema, pneumonia, overinflation of lungs, then the microembolism in the pulmonary capillaries, then the stimulation by exogenous and endogenous chemical substances such as histamine, halothine, bradykinin, serotonin, and phenyl-D-guanide. Now we have discussed about the effect of the stimulation of J receptors. The stimulation of the J receptors produces a reflex response which is characterized by apnea, and apnea is followed by hyperventilation, bradycardia, hypotension, and weakness of the skeletal muscles. Now, role of the J receptor in physiological condition is not clear. However, these receptors are responsible for the hyperventilation and in patient affected by pulmonary congestion and the left heart failure. Now we have discussed about the impulses from the irritant receptor of lungs. In the lungs, we have known about the stress receptor. Beyond the stress receptor, there is another type of receptor present in the bronchi and bronchioles of the lungs, that is called irritant receptors. And irritant receptors are stimulated by irritant chemical substances or agents like the ammonia and sulfur dioxide. And this type of receptors are afferent impulse This type of receptors send afferent impulses to the respiratory centers via the vagal nerve fibers, and stimulation of irritant receptors produces reflex hyperventilation and with bronchospasm, and hyperventilation along with bronchospasm prevents the further entry of harmful agents into the blood, into the alveoli. Now, impulses from baroreceptors. Baroreceptor or pressure-receptors are the receptors which give response to change in the blood pressure. And what is the function of baroreceptor? Baroreceptors in the carotid sinus and the arch of aorta give response to increase in blood pressure, and whenever the arterial blood pressure increases, the baroreceptors are activated and send inhibitory impulses to vasomotor center in the medulla oblongata, and this causes the decrease in blood pressure and inhibition of respiration. However, in physiological conditions, the role of baroreceptor in regulation is insignificant. Chemoreceptors play an important role in the chemical regulation of the respiration. Details are discussed in the later part of this chapter. We will discuss in the tomorrow. Now, impulses from proprioceptor. Proprioceptors are nothing but receptors which give response to change in the position of the body, and these receptors are situated in the joints, tendons, and muscles. Now, proprioceptors are stimulated during the muscular exercise and send impulses to brain, particularly cerebral cortex, through the somatic upper nerves, and cerebral cortex in turn causes the hyperventilation by sending impulses to medullary respiratory centers. Now, the impulses from thermoreceptor. Thermoreceptors are cutaneous receptors which give response to change in environmental temperature. These thermoreceptors are of two types. One is receptor for cold and receptor for warmth. When the body is exposed to cold, or when the cold water is applied over the body, the cold receptors are stimulated and send impulses to the cerebral cortex via the somatic upper nerves, and cerebral cortex in turn stimulates the respiratory centers and causes hyperventilation. And the impulses from pain receptors. The pain receptors are those which give the response to pain stimulus, and whenever the pain receptors are stimulated, the impulses are sent to the cerebral cortex via the somatic afferent nerves, and cerebral cortex in turn stimulates the respiratory centers and causes the hyperventilation. Now, there is a diagram that is thermoreceptor, proprioceptor, and pain receptor acts upon the cerebral cortex, which will act upon the respiratory center. But the peripheral chemoreceptor, central chemoreceptor, baroreceptor, and lung receptor acts upon respiratory center, which will act upon the spinal motor neuron, and which will act upon respiratory muscle, and process of respiration occurs. So this is our today's topic. Today our topic is very important. Know the factors which affect the respiration. Now, if you have any query or any doubt, you can comment down in the comment section. I will try to reply them all. And thank you so much for watching the entire video. Do like, share, subscribe to my channel for supporting me and my channel, and thank you so much.